Very warm welcome to Professor Gaetano Chiurazzi. I present shortly his work. He is full professor of philosophy at the University of Torino, director of project at the Collège International de Philosophie, Paris. He worked as a research fellow in the universities of Torino, Berlin, Heidelberg, Paris, Oxford, Warsaw, Freiburg. His interests are specially focused in ontology, metaphysics, theory of judgment, philosophy of translation, with a particular focus on ancient Greek philosophy, classic German philosophy, and contemporary French philosophy. He has published 8 books. His books are translated into English, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and even to Serbian. His last book is published in 2021, entitled Seconda Natura, dall'asco al digitale, if I pronounce it well. And he has told me that his favorite book is Dynamis, Ontology of the Incommensurable, in 2017. He is editor-in-chief of the review Tropos, Rivista di Hermeneutica e Critica Filosofica, and now he will speak about event and asymmetry. So, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation, and I would like to thank also my friend Miklos Niro for the invitation to this conference, and the organizers of this event, and of course all of you for attending my speech. So the title of my presentation is Event and Asymmetry. It makes a reference to this concept, asymmetry, which I have been interested in for a few years. So I will so the emphasis that contemporary philosophy placed on the concept of the event may seem exaggerated in some respects. Actually, one may wonder why historical events deserve such an emphasis when philosophy, especially metaphysics, has generally been concerned with the immutable and the eternal. In Book Epsilon of the Metaphysics, Aristotle says that to on legetai polakos. Being is said in different ways. But although he lists the accidental first, metaphysical inquiry focuses almost exclusively on the other three, being as categories, and in particular substance, that which endures and remains identical through change, being as potentiality and actuality, and being as true or false. The first mode, the accidental being, that which is katasymbebekos, that which pertains to what happens, has always remained at the margins of philosophical reflection. This is hardly surprising, given that Aristotle himself asserts that no scientific treatment is possible for this kind of being. Science, he argues, concerns only what endures, an axiom most clearly articulated by Parmenides, and not what is changeable or contingent. Despite its marginal status in traditional metaphysics, the term event in ordinary language typically designates something remarkable, extraordinary, or epoch-making. This everyday meaning finds an echo in contemporary philosophical treatment of the concept. In an interview with Giovanna Borradori, following the collapse of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, Jacques Derrida introduces the notion of a major event. an occurrence characterized by radically abruptness, unpredictability, and often violent rupture. Its impact, he observes, is intensified by mediatization. The event becomes embedded within a system of information, circulation, and transformation, frequently in spectacular form, as exemplified by the case of 9/11. What characterizes a major event is not, however, its grandeur per se. Although the word major emphasizes height and scale, writes Derrida, the evaluation cannot be purely quantitative. An event becomes major by virtue of the qualification it receives. To designate something as a major event is to engage in a normative or evaluative act, an act that considers its consequences, its effects, and the scope of the transformation it brings about. Yet, as previously noted, such a qualification is not necessary for an event to occur. The fact that September 11 is referred to solely by a date, 9/11, that it carries a purely deictic designation, devoid of any intrinsic qualification, offers a crucial clue for understanding the nature of the event. Derrida writes, the telegram of this metonymy, a name, a number, points out the unqualifiable by recognizing that we do not recognize or even cognize, that we do not yet know how to qualify, that we do not know what we are talking about. September 11th functions as a mere temporal marker, indicating a moment in time at which a rupture, with all its disruptive force, becomes manifest. More broadly, the event is defined by the differentials it introduces, however imperceptible or infinitesimal, within a pre-existing situation. When reduced to its temporal marker, September 11 reminds us that an event is, at its core, something utterly banal and ordinary. The French Revolution or the birth of Christ are events, as is the bombing of Hiroshima, or, as Heidegger teaches, the creation of a work of art. But so too is the falling of a leaf, a summer storm, or a walk taken in the afternoon. In this sense, everything that happens is an event. To understand this rather ordinary meaning of the event, it may be useful to refer to the etymology of this word. The word event derives from the Latin e venire, meaning to come forth, to emerge, to arise, that is, to appear, and thus to occur. The German term Ereignis, which, beginning in 1936, Heidegger adopted as a light word for his philosophy, and which has since acquired a quasi-technical status, offers a deeper insight. In the entry Ereignis of the Dictionnaire des Intraduisibles, edited by Barbara Cassin, it is noted, following Wolfgang Brockmeier, that Ereignis has to be more properly understood as Eroignis, in the sense of vor Augen stellen, to place before the eyes, that is, to show, to make manifest, in Latin ostendere, manifestare. We can then say that the event, in its most banal and at the same time deepest sense, concerns thus everything that appears, that comes forth, that takes place or comes into being, and is indicated only in a deictic way, as by saying cities. The event should therefore not be interpreted as something exceptional. The marginality that Aristotle attributed to the κατάσυμ βεβαικός and the emphasis contemporary philosophy has placed on the event converge in the absolute everydayness and pervasiveness of the event as happening. Indeed, an event occurs at every moment, and however minimal it may be, its disruptive force lies in its capacity to produce a change that may be more or less traumatic. Every transformation must in fact confront the question of its tolerability. It inevitably forces us to re-examine some aspects of ourselves, of our worldview, to renegotiate our very relations with others and the world. This is something Hegel captured with great force in the ever-renewed reconfigurations of consciousness in the philosophy of spirit. For this reason, the event, inasmuch as it breaks, even partially, with the inertia of ordinary existence, is always, in a certain sense, incomprehensible. As Derrida writes, the undergoing of the event, that which is the undergoing or in the ordeal, at once opens itself up to and resists experience. It seems to me a certain unappropriability of what comes or happens. The event is what comes, arrive, and in coming comes to surprise me, to surprise and to suspend comprehension. The event is first of all that which I do not first of all comprehend. Better, the event is first of all that I do not comprehend. It consists in that I do not comprehend. That which I do not comprehend, and first of all, that I do not comprehend. The fact that I do not comprehend. My incomprehension. In its conciseness, Derrida's statement, the event is the fact that I do not comprehend, is particularly powerful. It exposes the constitutive core of trauma and the ambivalence that defines it, suspended between a positive, objectual moment, the fact, the thing I do not understand, and a negative, transcendental one, the fact that I do not understand, the very limit of my understanding. These two aspects are intrinsically entangled, much like the thing in itself and the limit of experience in Kantian philosophy. Starting from Derrida's definition, the event is the fact that I do not comprehend, I would like to develop a few reflections on the nature of the event, focusing on two interrelated aspects. On the one hand, its factual dimension, what might be described as its rupturing or energetic force. On the other, its semantic dimension, its capacity to be or to give rise to a trace, including in the sense of trauma, the opening of a fracture or incision that is at once incomprehensible in itself and yet inherently meaningful, generative of sense. These two dimensions, which I propose to understand as constituting a kind of diagrammatics of the event, belong to its very constitution, to its internal structure, and to its status as origin, as the inception of something new. To illustrate what I mean here by the diagrammatics of the event, I will examine one of the most iconic, indeed the most important term in Derrida's philosophy, the word difference. As we know, Derrida says that it does not denote any object or concept. In a sense, difference means nothing other than the event of its own occurrence. The fact that something has happened, namely that a letter, the A, has replaced an E. In this way, it literally demonstrates in a letter the inherently differential nature of every event. A difference must occur for something to happen. And the fact that the A primarily denotes this differential event places Derrida's perspective directly above structuralist differentialism, which understands differences not as dynamic, but always as static. A difference thus conceived has a diagrammatic nature. A diagram does not properly represent an object, but rather operations. An electrocardiogram or an encephalogram, for instance, tells us nothing about what the heart or the brain are. It does not show them to us, but it reveals their operations as differential variation from a 0 point, assumed as the origin for their recording. Similarly, the word difference graphically records a variation that has occurred, the shift from E to A difference that has no phonetic equivalent, which opens up an entire discourse, though not central here, on alphabetical writing and phonocentrism. So, the word difference doesn't actually mean anything. Its entire content resolves into a graphic variation, the A in place of the E, which can only be understood as a trace, as a symptom of the fact that something has happened, just as a diagram recording the brain or heart activity. Yet, we cannot deny that this word, having emerged as an event in writing, has given rise to a sense. Here, I wish to use the term sense not so much to signify a determinate content, but in its literal meaning. A sense is the indication of an orientation, of a direction. This is quite clear in my language, Italian. For example, the phrase senso unico is used in traffic signs to indicate a one-way direction, which English expresses with the word way, a one-way. Sense is like a path. It is an effect of writing, because writing produces an incision, a frayage, to use a term Derrida himself employs, borrowed from psychoanalysis. Frayage is the translation of the Freudian Bahnung, to indicate the disruptive force of writing, a rupture that consequently makes a difference. The event as inscribed within a diagram makes a difference, produces a difference. Although there is originally no content to be understood, as in the case of the word difference, the event makes a difference. It originates sense. Indeed, I will venture to say it is the very origin of the sense, its 0 point. So what has been said so far can be briefly captured in a formula that enables me to develop the discussion on multiple levels. The event is a sign or a trace of an asymmetry. With this formula, I intend to summarize a series of issues that have been briefly mentioned and that I wish to further elaborate below concerning a modal level in which the concept of dynamis intervenes, that is what I call modal asymmetry, an ontological level related to reality or existence, the coming into being, an ontological asymmetry, and a cognitive level pertaining to the formation of sense, the cognitive asymmetry. I consider these three levels or aspects of asymmetry as constitutive of the concept of the event. So, the term asymmetry is here primarily used as a synonym for difference in a simplest way, but with the added reference to its literal meaning, derived from the Greek asymmetron, that is non-commensurable or incommensurable, indicated that such difference represents something irreducible. The conceptual pair commensurable-incommensurable, or symmetry-asymmetry, provides one of the most radical conceptual frameworks in the entire history of thought, informing metaphysics, physics, ethics, and aesthetics. For instance, in aesthetics, we conceive, for instance, beauty in terms of symmetry, of equilibrium. Even in ethics, some very important concepts of ethics are for us connected with symmetry. For instance, justice, not the symbol of justice, the balance, the equilibrium, the symmetry. So it is a very, very influential concept. So, to grasp this, I would like to begin with the meaning that the term symmetry holds today in physics. Here, symmetry refers to invariance under a transformation. Symmetry principles are in fact conservation principles that indicate what remains unchanged within a given phenomenon. At the philosophical level, we might consider the way Parmenides conceives of being as eternal, immutable, and unmoving as one of the most powerful symmetries in the history of philosophy. It is no coincidence that Parmenides compares being to a well-rounded sphere, since the sphere is the most symmetrical geometric object, remaining identical to itself under all possible permutations, that is, under all rotations around any of its diameters. A philosophical concept analogous to symmetry is that of substance and not continuum. I want to stress this point because normally they are confused, but this is a misunderstanding in my opinion. As we have already noted, substance expresses what remains invariant and identical beyond superficial and accidental transformations. Here too, the fact that Kant associates the concept of substance in the first analogy of experience with Newton's first law, the principle of inertia, only confirms this association. It states that a body remains at rest or in uniform linear motion unless acted upon by an external force. The symmetry here lies in the persistence of a state until an external cause intervenes, that is, until a difference, an asymmetry, emerges. Symmetry in this sense is resistance to transformation. This is the physical definition of symmetry by Rosen in Symmetry in Science. For transformation and becoming to occur, symmetry must be broken. Asymmetry must be introduced. Pierre Curie expressed this idea clearly in Sur la symétrie dans les phénomènes physiques. Certain elements of symmetry can coexist with some phenomena, but they are not necessary. What is necessary is that certain elements of symmetry do not exist. It is the symmetry that creates the phenomenon. This is a fundamental assertion. to give rise to a phenomenon, Curie tells us symmetry is not necessary. Rather, what is necessary is asymmetry. An event, therefore, occurs by virtue of an asymmetry, without which it would otherwise be impossible. If symmetry defines the inertial state of a system, how then is movement, transformation, and change possible? This is a Parmenidean question. So the answer to this question may seem obvious. A transformation is possible thanks to the possible. The legitimacy of this answer lies in a connection traceable in ancient philosophy, particularly within the mathematical context of Plato's time, between the concept of the possible and the notion of asymmetry, asymmetron. In the Titus, for instance, in the context of the famous mathematics lesson in which Theodorus praises Titus' intellectual abilities, the lines corresponding to the so-called rectangular numbers, namely those numbers that are not perfect squares, such as 2, 3, or 5, not perfect square are the square numbers like 4, 9, etc. So these rectangular numbers are called just dynamis. This is what we today call irrational magnitudes, just like the diagonal of the square. And why? Because they have the capacity to become commensurable when squared. They refer indeed to a dimension that is other, different from that of the natural numbers, which were considered by the Pythagoreans as the very form of reality, because for the Pythagoreans, reality was made by whole numbers, natural numbers. With the introduction of incommensurable numbers, a new ontology emerges, one that beyond the actual, that is beyond the positivity of the natural numbers, also accounts for the non-actual, the relative non-positivity of irrational numbers. What is the dynamis? It is something non-actual. The outcome of this process can likely be found in Plato's definition of being in the Sophist. I resume here the content of my book, which was mentioned before, Dynamis. So in the Sophist, Plato gives this definition of being. I'll take it as a definition that those which are amount to nothing other than capacity, dynamis. Although this definition is indeed an apax legomenon within the Platonic corpus, it is, in my view, far from insignificant. This definition entailing the consideration of a form of non-being, a non-being that in some way is, a non-actuality, which is precisely what dynamis signifies, serves as a response to Parmenides and this is absolutely positive conception of being, one devoid of negation and thus of change and movement. It was, however, Aristotle, as is well known, who made dynamis the principle of change, the arche tes metaboles. Aristotle also keenly recognized that dynamis must necessarily have a differential nature. The definition he provides in chapter 2 of the Metaphysics attests to this. Aristotle writes that dynamis is the principle of change into something else or into itself as something else. In other words, for there to be capacity and thus the possibility of transformation, there must be a minimal differentiality, either between oneself and other, or between oneself and oneself as other. Without this difference, or to make reference again to the mathematical definition of dynamis, without this asymmetry, there would be no change. Nothing would happen. However, this idea of dynamis as the principle of change, of metabole, was in a certain sense anticipated by Plato himself, notably in the Parmenides. In a famous passage dealing with the problem of how contradictory determinations, being large or small, young or old, can both be possible in the same object, i.e. how becoming and ceasing to be, Gegenstein and Apollostein, what Parmenides denied are possible, Plato introduces the concept of exiphanes. The exiphanes is the point in time at which the transition, Plato says the metabalein, the metabole, from one determination to another is realized. Yet, precisely for this reason, the exiphanes does not belong to chronological time, that is countable, measurable time, which according to Aristotle consists of nows, which are parts of time. It is therefore astonishing and unlocalizable, atopon. For these reasons, as Imre Toth recognized in his book about the Zenon paradox, exiphanes is often associated with the incommensurable. The term exiphanes is normally translated as instant. However, this translation poses certain problems as it carries the connotation of standing in stare, of remaining and therefore of non-change. On the contrary, the Greek term literally alludes to movement and origin. The preposition ek, indeed, indicates a motion from a place, a coming out, and consequently also a moving towards. In fact, Plato writes that exiphanes, I quote, seems to indicate something from which, ex ekeno, a change occurs towards one of the two states. More than an instare, the exiphanes indicates an ex stare. It is the point of coming to be and ceasing to be, of existere and desistere. Moreover, the second part of the word exiphanes does not convey what the verb to stand carries, from which the term instant is derived. According to a certain etymology, the second part of exiphanes derives from the adjective aipius, meaning high, elevated, steep, precipitous. Thus, exiphanes signifies an evenience from above, at once looming and overhanging, that bursts forth suddenly, descends obliquely, and brings about a transformation in the unfolding or becoming. It therefore alludes to a vertical or oblique dimension, one might say diagonal, rather than a horizontal, immanent dimension of instare. It is, however, important also to note that exiphanes is properly not a name, but an adverb, and is often translated as suddenly. A better translation might be the Latin phrase ex abrupto, which preserves both the sense of deriving from ex and the sense of rupture or irruption. If one were to find an example of its meaning, it might be found, though not exclusively, in the condition of death in Heidegger's existential analytics, which looms and occurs suddenly. It is to such a sudden transformation, emerging from a known place, that Plato alludes when, in the myth of the cave, he uses this very word to describe the change that happens abruptly to the prisoner, leading to his liberation from the chains. For all these reasons, we could say that exiphanes can be regarded as at the very end, as the Greek concept most closely to what Heidegger later conceptualizes with the term ereignis, that is, the event. So what I aimed to show with these considerations on event and asymmetry, and the insertion of the concept of dunamis between them, is the idea that the origin of every event, insofar as it is rooted, and I use this word explicitly given its mathematical significance, in a dunamis, in a form of asymmetry. First, in the sense that such a dynamis is irreducible to what is actual, to whole numbers, and secondly, in the sense that it is intrinsically differential in itself. This potential, the dynamis, to put it again in physical terms and citing Simondon, cannot be but metastable. The concept Heidegger associates with the modal dimension of being in the Beiträge zur Philosophie, that of oscillation or vibration, Schwanken or Schwingen, is probably another way to understand this dynamic meta-stability of the dynamic principle. The event is the outcome of this original asymmetry, constitutive of the very concept of dynamis. To the so-called modal asymmetry I have just introduced, we must add what I have called ontological asymmetry. This concerns the very outcome of the event, the coming into being of something, its sudden emergence into the state as it manifests itself, its existere. A consequence of the asymmetric nature of existence is the idea that it cannot be reduced to symmetric relations, that is, relations of equivalence or identity. In my view, this corresponds to Kant's treatment of the concept of existence in his refutation of the ontological proof of God's existence. As is well known, for Kant, existence is not a logical predicate that can be deduced from the concept of something, in this case from the concept of the perfect being, God. If all judgments could be reduced to judgment of identity, that is, to analytical judgments, as Leibniz claimed, then existence itself would be an analytic predicate, whose negation would imply a contradiction. But Kant objects that there is no intrinsic contradiction in saying that God exists or does not exist. Existence is therefore a synthetic predicate that adds something to the concept of a thing. To say that something exists, therefore, means to introduce a difference that goes beyond its concept, its definition, or its identity. Existence is a non-logical or alogical predicate in the sense that it is external to the concept of an object. This ontological asymmetry, however, pertains to any historical fact, insofar as it has actually occurred and exists. It marks the difference between the pure possible and real, between dynamis and energia, of course, potentiality and actuality, or between a physical law and its realization in a determinate phenomenon. It refers to the difference, we might also say, between truth of reason and truth of fact. Truth of reason and historical truth, we can say. Leibniz, for whom every truth ultimately reduces to a judgment of identity, was not less well aware that truth of fact, the historical and contingent truth, cannot be reduced to truth of reason except, as he writes, in the mind of God, that is, through an infinite process of approximation. Their difference is precisely analogous to that between commensurable and incommensurable magnitudes. He writes, namely, I quote from on the characteristics. The difference between necessary truth and contingent truth is indeed the same as that between commensurable numbers and incommensurable numbers. In the same way, in fact, that the factorization can become a unity of shared measure in commensurable numbers, so too in necessary truths the demonstration or reduction leads to identical truth. As with irrational numbers, the factorization proceeds to infinity, and indeed we arrive at a common unity of measure and obtain a series, however undetermined. In the same way and with the same process, contingent truths require an infinite analysis, which only God can conduct. If truth of reason can be expressed through analytic relations, thus according to a principle of commensurability relative to a fundamental magnitude, truth of fact cannot be expressed in the same way. Instead, they involve a kind of divisibility that leads to no ultimate reason or final ratio. The infinite analysis entailed by each truth of fact excludes that the process of resolution culminates in an equation or in identical propositions. That is the way in which, according to Leibniz, truth can and must be expressed. In the gap between truth of reason and truth of fact, one can discern the difference between the mathematical equation of a physical law and the actual physical state, its realization. The level of the law corresponds to a pure symmetry where nothing happens. The historical level of events, which belongs to time, requires the breaking of this symmetry, through which events are generated. An event is thus the result of asymmetries, which also means that the temporal order it produces cannot be reversed. This is very important for me, this connection with the irreversibility. In the analogies of experience, Kant distinguishes the perception of a house, that is a static object whose sensible apprehension can begin at any point without a predefined order, from the perception of an occurrence, of an event, such as the descent of a ship along a river, which must be perceived in precise sequence, and I cannot reverse. We may say that in what is static there is no defined order. Its apprehension can start at any point, since all points are equivalent. Conversely, in what occurs there is always an order that cannot be arbitrarily altered. This simple example makes clear the idea, contrary to the usual conception, that symmetry is connected with disorder, or as also expressed in physics with the increase of entropy, whereas asymmetry is linked to order, namely to the existence of a non-reversible relation. It is no coincidence that Heidegger identifies irreversibility as a defining feature of authentic existential time, one that is distinct from merely chronological or measurable time as conceived by metaphysics. In the lecture delivered before the Theological Faculty of Marburg in 1924, entitled The Concept of Time, where one can already discern the early development of his later work, Being and Time, Heidegger indeed writes that irreversibility is a feature of primordial and authentic time, which constitutes the implicit and ineliminable ground of time, even where it is reduced to a mere quantitative succession of homogeneous nows. He writes, but even in this pure sequence of nows, which passes away in itself, primordial time still manifests itself throughout all this leveling off and covering up. In the ordinary interpretation, the stream of time is defined as an irreversible succession. Why cannot time be reversed, especially if one looks exclusively at the stream of nows? It is incomprehensible in itself why this sequence should not present itself in the reverse direction. The impossibility of this reversal has its basis in the way public time organizes in temporality, the temporalizing of which is primarily futural and goes to its end ecstatically in such a way that it is already towards its end. The leveling of time that takes place in its chronological measurement in public time cannot erase its being advenient, and namely its being turned into a direction, its having a precise orientation. In the succession of the nows, what is authentic is the eventual character of primordial time, which assumes a direction, beginning from a point of origin, a limit from which it departs, the birth, or towards which it goes, the death. by introducing an order, a direction, the event of which the phenomena of birth and death are emblematic as they come to be and pass away, allows the relations of anteriority and posteriority, before and after, to be defined. This irreversibility also introduces a qualitative difference, since one instant is never equivalent to another. For that reason, a historical event, precisely because it is historical, does not return and can never be repeated in the way that it occurred. The event thus that determines a return in the series of temporal nows. An event that repeats is not properly an event. The recurrences through which events are reminded are just a mode of recording them, which do not diminish, but in fact accentuate their uniqueness, and even more so as the recurrence is emphasized. We can remember or commemorate our birth, someone's death, the French Revolution, but this doesn't mean that that event is repeated. Rather, it is remembered precisely as an event, something that happened and altered the course of history, but cannot be repeated. The event thus gives time a determinate orientation, granting it quite literally a sense. Sense, before being a specific content or the identity of something, is a mode of orientation in the world, a concept that can be related also to the Heideggerian concept of Formalanzeige, the formal indication, which Heidegger defines exactly as a direction. At a graphical level, its originary constitution of the sense can be represented as a line or a trace. This is what I mean by cognitive asymmetry. The idea that in its very happening, the event produces itself as a trace, treillage, or guiding line of a possible orientation. Heidegger's discussion of a particular event, the origin of the artwork, illuminates this point well. His analysis of Van Gogh's painting might lead one to think that what matters in a work of art is its representational content. The fact that it depicts a pair of peasant shoes and how this can evoke an entire world seems to suggest, almost in Husserlian terms, that their fullness of meaning lies in their capacity to reconnect us with the peasant's Lebenswelt. However, the subsequent example Heidegger offers displaces this very idea. By introducing the example of the Greek temple, Heidegger specifies indeed, even if only in passing, that it represents nothing, bildet nicht ab, portrays nothing. In this case, any referential relation is bracketed, falling under the axe of an epoche that tends to empty the work of art of any content. The way Heidegger describes the Hervorbringen, bringing forth the production of the Greek temple, the event of its coming into being, highlights its purely formal, truly eidetic, I would say, dimension, understood as pure form. The temple thus emerges as a strife between earth and world. The strife, I quote, is not rift in the sense of a tearing open of a mere cleft. Rather, it is the intimacy of the mutual dependence of the contestants. The rift carries the contestants into the source of their unity, their common ground. It is the fundamental design, Grundriss. It is the outline sketch, Aufriss, that marks out the fundamental features of the rising up of the clearing of beings. This design, Riss, does not allow the contestants to break apart. It brings the contest between measure and limit into a shared outline, Umriss. So the temple is constituted as the emergence of a form, of a fundamental design that delineates an outline, a figure. The rift design is the drawing together into a unity of sketch and fundamental design, rupture and outline. This stripe, which is brought into the rift design and so set back into the earth and fixed in place, is the figure, Gestalt. The creativeness of the work means the fixing in place of truth in the figure. This is the truth of the work of the artwork. It opens up a world in the sense that it makes orientations possible through the inscription of a trace, the stabilization of a path, a design within the fundamental form of the trait, ris. For Heidegger, on the other hand, truth can only occur in the traced sign, in the rift. The outline sketch, Heidegger writes, marks out, zeichnet, the fundamental features of the rising up of the clearing of beings. We could say, therefore, that Heidegger understands the work of art in a diagrammatic way, in the sense we explained above. By drawing a figure, the event of the artwork draws a world. It opens lines of meaning, traits or frayage, that orient the concrete existence of design. Like the temple, which opens a world, a cosmos, a space in which orientation becomes possible, and the bridge, which in building, dwelling, thinking, connects the two banks of the river, every work of art, or we could also say every artifact or production, every technical object, opens a world that is other than pre-existing physical world, by tracing possible orientations path. It is therefore originally a symbol, from symballing, to connect, to keep together. That is the auroral moment of the signifying function. So I go to the conclusion. So the question of the event leads us to raise fundamental issues in metaphysics. It can be said, in a certain sense, that the event shakes the very concept of foundation, understood as a stable structure and, as such, governed by a principle of symmetry. What I have sought to show, however, is that it is not symmetry, but asymmetry that constitutes the true foundation, capable of explaining change, the coming into being, existence or occurrence, and meaning. The diagrammatic consideration proposed here, of which the term difference is the most significant example, aims to highlight the purely eventual aspect proper to the event, its manifestation as difference, ontological asymmetry, by means of a difference, modal asymmetry, and capable of making a difference, cognitive asymmetry. If physics, that is, the scientific conception of nature, is guided by principles of symmetry, then it seems appropriate that metaphysics, as the thinking of what transcends or grounds physics, may rightly be said to begin where symmetry breaks, with asymmetry. Beyond physics, there is not a world of timeless and unchanging entities, but rather the historical world, a world of unrepeatable events and yet real, impermanent and yet capable of producing meaning, which are the very substance of historical life. Thank you for your attention.
And please, you can ask, make remarks. Maybe I begin the questions. If I remember well, you mentioned 3 times the Freudian concept of frayage. Is there any difference between frayage and différance, or Derrida uses frayage only as an example, an almost example of difference?
So he uses this word, of course, taken from Freud. No, frayage is the French translation of Banung. done so the facilitation in order to so to say that writing. So the question is quoted above all in the grammatology when he speaks about the nambic vara, the people which were supposed to be without writing. And he says that no, there is no culture, no people without writing, because even the freyage, for instance, the opening of a path in the wood, for instance, is a sort of writing. So in extensive sense, this means that writing open up a certain direction in general, and this is what I wanted to say in the sense that the evening of something marks a difference, and this sense makes a difference. So in this sense, freyage is understood by Derrida.
I have a small question to a certain part of your talk. You made a close connection between the notions of event, asymmetry, and among others, irreversibility. And irreversibility.
Yeah.
And you said, to my mind, quite rightly, that events which would occur again are not really events. They cannot be repeated. And it just occurred to me that probably this is what we do when we make holidays or we celebrate Christmas. We repeat the exceptional, the unrepeatable. So there is some sense, it seems to me, there is some sense to repeat the unrepeatable. So just a small play.
Yeah, same.
Thank you.
Of course, I am aware that to insist on this concept of irreversibility of asymmetry makes also some problems. It is a challenge to a great history, no? Which of course has other models to understand being and so forth and so on. But I think that this concept of asymmetry is important in my view, because as I said, asymmetry is the condition of the order, in a certain sense, of the form, of the eidos. No, it is not the contrary, because normally we think that it is symmetry, which has this role, which has this role, and of course this is a challenge to a very, very deep paradigm of our way of thinking, as I said. Now, for instance, I say that symmetry plays an important role in aesthetics, and Kant himself says that the beauty is a sort of symmetry in a certain sense, but he adds also that for instance, asymmetry is tied to the sublime. He says, when he speaks about the face of the human, he says that the face of the human is asymmetrical. So this insistence on symmetry maybe, so we are surrounded by symmetrical objects. So the windows, the chairs on which you are sitting now, etc., all is symmetrical. And maybe it derives from our body, which is symmetrical or is supposed to be symmetrical almost externally, because internally it is not symmetrical at all. But when Kant speaks about human face, he says that the human face is asymmetrical, and this is the sign of the infinity, that is of the sublime. There are also experiments, if you go online, of photographers that have tried to make symmetrical some photographs of even of very famous people, well-known people, and they are unexpressive. These very symmetrical faces are unexpressive. And so Kant makes this little reference, of course, because for him, human being is the place of infinity, of reason, and so forth and so on. And so even the concept of infinity in Greek world is introduced by the discovery of the irrational numbers, because they are divisible in infinity. No, you cannot stop at a certain point. No, the antanairesis, this procedure which Aristotle exposed in the topics with which I can divide a certain number, this antanairesis doesn't end. No, has no end, and this is how the infinity comes into play in philosophy. And so for me, it is it is interesting, this appearing of infinity, of course, and also the idea that originally this concept of asymmetron was tied with the dunamis. No? Today we say that a number is a power when it is elevated to something, but in the context of ancient mathematics, dunamis is what today we call root. No, there is a great discussion about that. Even an Hungarian historical of philosophy, Szabo, wrote an article about that. He denied that we have to understand dunamis as root, but as power. But there is a big discussion about that. There is an article of Vitrac in a book in French, Dunamis is the title of the book. Vitrac has demonstrated that for the ancient mathematician, dunamis meant root, what we understand as root, and only after, with Diodorus, not with Diophantus, excuse me, Diophantus, it took this meaning of power as elevation of something. So for me, this is very interesting because it's the place in which we can connect really mathematics with ontology. We have spoken about also Badiou. No, I have read something of Badiou, but not so much. But I have the impression that physics, has more to say in that sense. No, even Hegel, when he speaks about the powers in the chapter about quantity, says that we say that they are a sort of dunamis, a power, but no one today thinks in this context to the Aristotelian dunamis, to a sort of power, because in mathematics there is no force. No. But it is important for me that mathematics assume also a physical, so to say, significance, in the sense that my impression is that Badiou is still too much structuralist. No? And Derrida makes a process to introduce in structuralism something Nietzschean, so the Dionysiac, so to say, the force. There is this article, Force and Signification, in L'écriture et la différence, in which he tries to introduce the dynamism into the structure. And so this is important for me to interpret in that way a mathematical concept in physical terms.
Thank you, Professor. Incidentally, my question concerns Hegel, which you just mentioned.
Hegel.
Yes, and was notoriously absent from the presentation. But I know you have dealt with this topic in the past, especially differential calculus. My question is, could we not develop a closer look towards the contemporary concept of infinity, not from Aristotle, for which infinity is perhaps something negative, the lack of a telos, but couldn't we see precisely this movement of asymmetry in the way Hegel conceptualizes infinity, and the way he conceptualizes and represents the movement of the concept precisely through a process of incommensurability, we could say, perhaps influenced from Derrida also. And this also would lead to a totally different Hegel, perhaps, than the Hegel of totality and end of history and so on. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for your question. Hegel is not present in my presentation here, but is very present in my book, Dunamis, Ontology of the Incommensurable. There are 2 chapters about Hegel and his discussion about the differential calculus in the science of logic. I claim just that Hegel understands very well the idea that the incommensurability as introduced into philosophy. And even though we have the idea that for Hegel the absolute is a sort of symmetrical object, no, circularity, speculativity, no, etc. I think that for Hegel what is very important in the becoming, no, in the differential calculus is the calculus for the becoming, of the becoming. He understands very well, no, the function of the incommensurability. And I quote only that. The last quotation of my book is taken from the Encyclopedia when Hegel discusses about mathematics and the discovery of incommensurable magnitudes in paragraph 231 of the Encyclopedia. He says something very astonishing, because Hegel is known as one who is against mathematics. But in this paragraph he says, in mathematics, through this discovery, no, what happened? So happened that the intellectual way to think mathematics through rational numbers, that is whole numbers and fractions, which are ratios or relations between whole numbers, no? This mathematics finds an end. And the incommensurability is the very beginning of reason. This says Hegel. This is the very reason, because it's the idea that mathematics itself can be always beyond itself. Because from the natural numbers, through the construction of a simple problem, how to construct the square, no? The square with area of 2, which is one of the puzzling problem in Plato philosophy. No, mathematics is constrained to go beyond itself, and it goes, according to Hegel, from the intellectual way to conceive the numbers, that is through whole and fractions, to the very reasoning, which is the conception of irrational numbers. And he says here the problem is the language, because in the language we use today still the word rational for the relations between whole numbers, and irrational for the real numbers. But it is not like so. Irrational numbers are not something irrational, are the very beginning of reason, according to Hegel. And when Hegel says that the real is rational, we have to think to that, in my opinion. And so this is the very form of the ration, because it is a form of infinity, to take account with infinity, and to make, to conceive a sort of relation, because there is no irrational number without a relation. And Hegel says this very well when he speaks about the quanta. He says with the incommensurable number, the idea that a number can exist without relation with something else is impossible. Well, we think that the quanta are 1, 2, 3, something which exists in itself, no? But the rational number are relations at the very end, because it has no sense to conceive of the diagonal as something irrational without the relation with the side. It is irrational only in relation with the side. And this is the form of the true infinite, because Heidegger says that in mathematics we can find the true infinite. And this is this form which is shown by the integral calculus, differential calculus by Hegel. So I agree completely with that, but Hegel is a big reference for me for this problem.
Yes?
Thank you very much. That was a very rich and generous presentation. So my question, it's more a curiosity that was inspired by the conclusions of your presentation, and I wonder if you see your account on event and asymmetry somehow in dialogue with Rainer Schurman's concept of anarchy. In reading Heidegger, or if not. But that was really inspired by the last part of your presentation, because it reminded me some of the linguistic choices that he also made. Thank you very much.
So I don't know so well Ullmann really, but I don't know how to answer to this question, excuse me, in the sense that what I can say is that with the concept of, I don't want that asymmetry is confused with something chaotic. No? If anarchy means something like that, without order, without principle, etc., no, I would say absolutely no. I think that asymmetry is the principle of the order, if I use this term principle in some way. And so this means very easily not that the organization is something which we have to impose to ourselves, but it is something which is inevitable. Inevitable even at the very, very everyday experience of the events of the everyday. I am constrained to pass through that door if I want to exit this room. So, and this makes a sort of a direction, just like the temple, according to Heidegger, no? An architecture, something like that, makes a sort of order, but without order there is no sense. No? This is my point. A sense is a direction. And Heidegger says this also when he speaks about the difference between the stone, the animal, and the human, which is interpreted even by Derrida in a very wrong way, according I think. It's not a metaphysical distinction. It's the idea that the stone goes nowhere. It is unable to grasp a sense of being, but a sense in general. Because it goes nowhere. No? The animal goes somewhere. Even the vegetables, the plants, have a certain form of orientation, in the towards the light, for instance. But the human being are Weltforming, Weltbilder, in the sense that they construct Bannungen, Freyage in nature, and this makes sense. This is the idea. So, excuse me for Ullmann.
So, thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. Given all the topics that you've spoken about, there is one in particular that I know that you studied that maybe it's missing, which is the theme of analogy, especially in thinking about mathematics and so on. And yeah, the topic is very immense, and I'd just like to have to know what's your stance about this question. Analogy, where does it stand? It stands on symmetry or asymmetry? Because, for example, if we think about what Aristotle says about metabasis, how can we reach the metabasis? We breach, we rupture the genus. And in a lot of passages it's thanks to analogy. Also the analogy of experience in Kant. But on the other hand, and I think about Enzo Melandri, what Melandri says is that in reality, analogy is a principle of the homogeneous. And for example, he says the main reasons why medieval theologians stopped using an analogy is because at some point they realized that it was bringing to atheism. Analogy was this like conceptual tool that helped them to make everything on the same level. And he goes for a lot of pages talking about the fact that in reality analogy is something reversible, which is also something that you talked about, and that pertains to something that is flat, so to say. So I'd like to know something about that from your stance. Thank you.
So thank you for the question, which is very broad, and I cannot answer in a few words now. But of course, analogy, the theory of analogy arises just as a consequence of the discovery of the incommensurable magnitudes. The theory of Eudoxus was produced just in consequence of this, because in analogy we can manage irrational numbers. For instance, in the formula, which is the resolution of the square, no? Diagonal of the square 1 to x equal x to 2. Of course, analogy is a sort of equation. No, in this sense, is a form of symmetry. No, because it states an equivalence between the two sides of, and is a way and to make symmetron what is asymmetron. No, well, the x in this case, which becomes 2. No, at the end of the proposition. Proportion is the translation of analogia. So of course, but there are other forms of analogy. It depends on which we understand analogy. Even Kant, that you mentioned, distinguishes two forms of analogy: the mathematical analogy, to which we construct the last term, and the philosophical analogy, which gives the existence, but existence cannot be constructed. So if this is also an analogy, is an asymmetrical in a certain sense analogy, in the sense that you cannot put equivalence, no, between what is given as existence, even in a sort of proportion. No? So, but it is a very broad question, no? But of course there are also disproportion, no? Not only proportion as equivalence, but also disproportion. So, but so this is but the advantage anyway of analogy is the fact that analogy makes possible to think of the continuum. Without analogy we cannot think the continuum.
I just have one more small question concerning language as well, but maybe language, but maybe philosophical as well. I think one of your most important distinction is between actual and non-actual, and so actual is real and non-actual is real as well, but not actual. Okay?
Yes.
And I think in the 20th century thinking that there have been a lot of essay to grasp this form of reality which is real but not actual. You mentioned Simondon's concept of metastability, but I had in mind the concept of virtuality from Bergson on until I don't know. So this is. So the question is, it's not better to find a positive concept than a negative one, because non-actual is a negative and it depends on somehow actuality.
Yes, of course. No, in a certain sense, what is only possible. No, this is the polemic of Aristotle against the Megarians. No, Megarians denied completely the reality in a certain sense of possibility as such. No. Because what exists is only actuality, and if I am seated, and I have not the possibility to stand up. No, what is this possibility? Of course, this is very difficult to grasp. I think that the polemic, the question here is the cognitive way in which we approach this problem. Because I tied always actuality with the natural numbers, in the sense that actuality is what I can count. I can say how many people there are here, and even in logic, when through the quantify, normally they say that existence is to say how many things there are in a set. No, for instance, I am against this idea of existence. No, but this is what many think, and so actuality is tied with the countability. No. What I can count, no. But for instance, we can think how many clouds there are in the sky. They exist, but how many they are? I don't know. Who can count the clouds? So we have to go beyond this idea, no, of reality as what is countable. If we think of actuality as what we can count, there are 2 things on this table, 4 things, and so on. This is a way to think of actuality. But in this sense, potentiality is not something which has no effect or doesn't exist in a certain way at all. It exists. Potential energy exists. But as I said, this is the way to grasp. No, I think that logic is too bound with sensible knowledge in a certain sense, because I can count how many people they are here because I can see them. But how I can see potentiality? This is the polemic of Aristotle against the Hegelian, which are a sort of Protagorean people in a certain sense, because they are tied to the idea that what exists is only what I can see now. No, and if I am seated, I cannot say that I have the potentiality of standing up. No, because I cannot see this. But this problem is the same with incommensurable magnitude. I cannot see them. Where I can see pi Greek? Nowhere. No, in this sense, this is the very reason. No, because this is the first demonstration, the diagonal of the square, which in ancient mathematics is made only by reason, a demonstration per absurd. No, because if for the Pythagoreans, reality is made by visible points, no, discrete points, just like in the computer, in the screen today, many pixels. This is really the world of the Pythagoreans, what we see on the screen of the computer. That's why my last book is about the digital philosophy. But I can see discrete points. No? And so this is this connection between natural numbers and sensibility. But I cannot see irrational numbers. So these are really a question of reason, not irrational.
I have an impression about your paper, and my question is whether this impression is right or wrong.
I have to say if it is right.
Thank you. So my impression is that probably you are suggesting that this whole topic of event was faced already by the Greeks.
This topic of event?
The topic of event, which is very contemporary, and it's post-metaphysical in a sense. Do you suggest that no, it's not post-metaphysical and it's not only contemporary, but already the Greeks faced something like that?
I don't mean that. I want just to say that some concepts which were elaborated already in Greek philosophy can be used to explain some issues in contemporary philosophy about the event.
Okay, so those certain Greek concepts,
yes,
they introduced.
For instance, this concept of excessiveness, but it is not so important by Plato in a certain sense. It is an excursus in the Parmenides. We don't say if this is the third deduction or just an addendum to the second deduction. So it's something atopos in itself.
Thank you.
Equation, symmetry. Inequality, asymmetry. The Heisenberg principle of indetermination is an inequality. It's one of the principles of quantum mechanics. Do you think that the role of the asymmetry is a role as a principle in to understand physics nature in general? Also, breaking symmetry in particular physical process, as nuclear process or like this. So the asymmetry is one way. Especially the asymmetry is in your point of view, one way to understand physics.
Yes, I think that this is symmetry is a great paradigm of contemporary physics, the principle of conservation, principle of symmetry. But we know that our universe was born through an asymmetry, not a baryonic asymmetry, in the sense that in this description, which I sum up in my way, so no, in the primordial interaction in the Big Bang, now the particles of matter and antimatter were equivalent. And nothing happened. At a certain point, some asymmetry arises. One particle of baryons, I remember 50 millions of antibaryon. And this is the question of the boson of Higgs boson, no? Boson of Higgs, which is also called the particle of God. So in this sense, because it's at the origin of the creation of our universe. So the idea is that we need an asymmetry in order something to be. And even in this theory of the universe, asymmetry is what has given an origin to our world. So some physics thinks that in the future the real problem of physics will be asymmetry and not anymore symmetry as has been until now. So I don't know if I have answered the question. Of course, there are many interesting points in physics about that.
So then, if there is no more remarks, thank you very much again for this very interesting.
Thank you.
and
Thank you.